This is Dr. Wendy Widder in her teaching on the book of Daniel. This is session number 5, Daniel chapter 2.
We're ready for Daniel chapter 2, and Daniel chapter 2 is our first Aramaic chapter. So if you remember, we have this chiastic structure in these Aramaic chapters. So chapters 2 and 7 are both going to be dreams or visions that involve 4 earthly kingdoms and God's 5th eternal kingdom. And then these other chapters we'll talk about when we get to them. So in terms of structure, we're at the outside of this chiasm. We're getting this cosmic scope, this cosmic look at God's reign. This chapter is really about God's superior knowledge and his eternal kingdom. So he is going to show himself to be the true source of knowledge over against all those Babylonian wisdom that there is. God is going to be the one who has true knowledge. He's the source of knowledge, and his eternal kingdom is the one that will last forever. So the themes in this book, 3 themes that come through pretty clearly as we go through it. Again, the sovereignty of God, which we picked up in chapter 1 with God giving his king and his vessels into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Another theme that we'll see emerge in this chapter is the pride of human kings and human rulers, their arrogance that characterizes what they do. And then a third theme that we'll see in this chapter is the challenge of this tension. God is sovereign. I'm living under a human king, a proud human king. The tension that creates for God's faithful people. So we'll see those 3 themes in this book, and then we'll actually continue to see them through the rest of the book. This chapter is classified as a court tale. It's one of those tales that looks, or stories that looks at a foreign captive serving in a royal court and really outshining the regular staff there. So Daniel is going to be standing before the king to interpret a dream that the king's experts couldn't interpret, and he's going to do it far better than they could have. But really, the point of the story is, what is Daniel's God like? It's not about how great Daniel is, it's about his God. So this is a longer chapter. I'm going to read it section by section as we go, so we can sort of keep track of where we are. We will start with verses 1 through 11, and this section really highlights for us Nebuchadnezzar's inferior knowledge. So his inferior knowledge and the inferior knowledge of his experts. All right. In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. All right, so that's the first section. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And it happens in his second year. This is early in the king's reign. So it's possible that he's still trying to establish loyalties. You can tell he doesn't trust the wise men. The text doesn't really tell us why, but he wants them to tell him not just the interpretation. He's not going to tell them the dream. Tell me the dream and the interpretation, and then I'll know that I can trust you. So it might be that as a young king, he's testing loyalties. The text doesn't tell us exactly the significance of it being in his second year, but that's one possibility. This is in the king's second year. If you're keeping track of dates and timing of things, you might realize that that creates a chronological difficulty between the events in his second year and chapter 1. So in chapter 1, he brings these captives to Babylon for 3 years of training. After those 3 years of training, then they can stand before the king. So the question here is, how is Daniel among one of the wise men in Nebuchadnezzar's second year when he needs to go through 3 years of training? After he trains for 3 years, he stands before the king. But we're only in Nebuchadnezzar's second year. You see the problem? It's a little difficult. There are a couple ways we can resolve this. I'll just take you through how we can resolve this. And it has to do, again, with how we're going to calculate years, how we're going to calculate Daniel's apprenticeship with the king's reign. So we have the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And we have, according to the Babylonian system, the year of his accession. Then we have year 1. Then we have year 2. Okay? Daniel's training. Well, this would be the first year, and this is 605 according to Daniel 1:1. This is the second year of training. This is the third year of training. Oops. So Daniel could have been in his third year of training during Nebuchadnezzar's second year, according to the Babylonian system of dating years. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that the story is really wanting to highlight that even a trainee, a foreign trainee, is going to outshine the best of Babylon. That's a possibility too. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, his spirit is troubled, and his sleep leaves him. This is not something that, if you have a bad dream, you might wake up and go, "Ooh, I shouldn't have had that midnight snack." You don't probably wake up and go, "Oh my word, what does that mean for my future?" But in the ancient Near East, dreams were significant sources of information and insight about the future. Babylonian religion, according to Babylonian religion and Mesopotamian religion, the gods communicated through dreams, often, not always, but often they would communicate through dreams. And especially if you're a king, the god is going to communicate with you typically or very often through dreams. It's common. So if you're the king in charge of a kingdom and you have a troubling dream, you really need to know what it means. It could be very important for your future as a king, for your empire. You've got to find a way to know what it means. In ancient Near Eastern religion, dreams are part of a larger category of divination. So in divination, the Mesopotamians believed that the gods had a plan for the world, they had a plan for people, they had a plan for the king, and they encoded those plans in messages in the natural world. So whether that meant stars, read the stars, patterns of the stars, whether that meant dreams, whether that meant something that sounds really bizarre to us, like reading animal entrails, or reading a liver, or reading oil, in a glass in wine, you drink oil, that means nothing to us. But in this religion, this religious system, those could have been messages from the gods. And it was very important that you had an expert who was trained to know what it meant. You say, how could you be an expert trained to know what it meant? Well, strangely enough, This was kind of science for them. So if we think of science, science is based on human observation. And so they have lots of ancient records for what signs meant, what it meant if an animal's liver was shaped a certain way or had an extra lobe there. If they saw that unique thing and then an event happened, they wrote that down. Well, then they see that same kind of liver again and, oh, look, it happened again. Whoa, we've got evidence here. We're collecting data. And so over a long period of time, all this information is saved in textbooks, for lack of a better word, that the experts were trained in. And they would study these so they would know what happened if your animal had a liver with an extra lobe on it. Oh, no, that's not good. Or if your calf was born malformed. Oh, what kind of deformity is it? Oh, well, that's a good one. That's a bad one. This is science. Weird to us, but it was science. And so there were experts trained in how to do this. Dreams were part of this, but dreams were a little bit different because dreams could actually be the result of a bad midnight snack, right? It's a little more subjective, and it also can't be observed by anybody. So if you have a malformed liver or you have animal entrails, you can have a couple people look at it and go, oh yeah, we all see it. That's what it means. If you have a dream, nobody else knows what it was. We're just, okay, you tell us what it was. Was it pizza or was it, okay, this is a significant message. So they're a little bit tricky. So often dreams required another source of confirmation. So there had to be some other kind of divination, some other kind of message encoded somewhere else that the diviner could go fact check or double check and make sure that he got the message right. So dreams are a little sketchy. They're still considered possible messages from the gods, but they're not quite as reliable. So when the king demands a verification or confirmation that the guys really know what they're talking about, that his experts really know the interpretation, it's not unusual to ask for confirmation. What is unusual is that the confirmation is, well, tell us the dream. Tell me the dream. Because no one would know that. Okay, what he typically would have done is tell me the interpretation and then tell me somewhere else you see that same message. So it would have required confirmation. His request is actually unprecedented. Okay, so the king calls in all of these experts, and we're not going to go through all these experts' different specialties. The point of it is that this is Babylon's best. Every expert is there. This is the professional group trained in all these sciences. They are the experts of the day, best in Babylon. So he calls them in. He says he wants to know what it means. And they say what they probably said 100 times before. Tell us the dream. We'll interpret it. That's what they did. That's part of the reason they were in the king's employment. He would tell the dreams. They would interpret them. They would go check the dream manuals, figure out what all the symbols meant, and bring back an answer. They could not have been prepared for what the king demanded. It was not the way it worked. The king is breaking the rules. And they actually will protest. No king has asked this. It's too difficult. And they're telling the truth. Because Daniel later says, no man could do that. You were making an impossible request. But the king blows up when they say, tell us the dream. He says, the command from me is firm. I'm going to tear you limb from limb. I'm going to put your houses in heaps. Tell me the dream and its interpretation, and I'll give you gifts and rewards. This is an impossible demand. We don't know exactly why the king is demanding it. Again, it could be loyalty. He wants to know if he can really trust them. Something in the backstory that we don't know. Maybe they had proved themselves untrustworthy. Maybe he wants an excuse to get rid of all of them. And this is the way to do it. He wants to start over. It's possible he forgot the dream. I think he remembered it, but I can't prove that. He needs a reliable interpretation. And for whatever reason, he has reason to suspect question his advisor's loyalty and truthfulness. So we don't know why. We just know that this king is portrayed really in extremes. His portrayal in this chapter and the next one is even worse. He's just a hot-headed, blows up in an instant, makes unreasonable demands, overreacts, and really is always kind of caricatured against Daniel, who is calm, cool, collected throughout. It's an interesting contrast. So they answer a second time, say, tell us the dream. And it's as if they're talking past each other. Nebuchadnezzar says, tell me the interpretation, tell me the dream and the interpretation. They say, tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. Tell me the dream and the interpretation. Tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. It's this back and forth. 3 times the king tells them. And they can't do it. They finally just throw up their hands and say, this is impossible, because it really was impossible. What's unusual in their response, though, is that they say, no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. What's interesting about that is that ancient people, and Babylonians, would have built temples for their gods to inhabit. They wanted their gods to dwell in some way among them. This is actually illustrated in the Bible. So Solomon built the temple for God, and God was going to dwell among his people. He was going to be their God. They were going to be his people. So it's kind of curious that the experts claimed that the gods didn't dwell among them. They had temples for that. It's possible that they're just panicked. The king's going to tear them limb from limb, and they just mean that their gods aren't actually there to help them right now. But what it does do in the narrative is it sets up Daniel. So Daniel is going to speak with his God, and he's going to get the answer that the king desires. And Daniel's going to become known as one in whom the spirit of the holy gods dwells. So quite a contrast with these advisors who say, the gods don't dwell among us. So we have set up for us this conflict, or this plot line, that drives the whole story. We have the king who has a dream. He needs it interpreted. His experts, they're inept. They can't do it. And we also have a lower level conflict here in a minute, that Daniel and his friends are going to be in danger of death when the king gives his death sentence. So we have two main problems that have to be resolved here. The big problem is that Nebuchadnezzar has inferior wisdom. He does not know the answer to his question, his troubling dream. Smaller problem here is the danger that Daniel and his friends will find themselves in. So the next section is verses 12 through 16. How does Nebuchadnezzar react to his wise men's inferior knowledge? Well, because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Again, you have this Daniel who takes in this information. He's not panicked. He goes to Arioch. He says, what's the deal? Arioch explains it to him. He goes before the king and he asks for exactly the same thing that the wise men asked for, time, and he got it. We aren't told why. We aren't told why Nebuchadnezzar gave him what he asked for. It just says Daniel went, did it, and he got it. Again, we see Daniel's wisdom. He's using discretion, discernment. He's finding the right way to achieve, to do the right thing. There's a lot of interaction going on in this section that isn't recorded for us. There's a lot of people talking, and the narrator doesn't give it to us. It's really a terse section. Lots of gaps, lingering questions. So, first of all, why is the king demanding the death of all the wise men? Daniel and his friends weren't even in this group, and now suddenly they're going to die too. Why did Arioch even bother to listen to Daniel? He's the executioner here. I mean, here he comes to execute. What does Daniel do? Raise his hand? Why are we being... What did he say to Daniel? It doesn't actually tell us what he said. How did Daniel manage to gain access to the king? Doesn't tell us. If If the king was so raging mad, how did Daniel manage to get him to give him time? Why is there so much talking that's not reported? How come we are not told what all these people said? We don't hear about the decree the king gave. We just heard that he gave a decree to do this. It doesn't tell us the exact decree. It doesn't tell us about the executioners. It doesn't tell us what Arioch said. We don't get any of that. Of all the possible spoken words that could have been recorded here, there's only one that's recorded, and that's Daniel's question to Arioch. So when Daniel says, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" That's the only direct quote we get in this whole section. Daniel is really a key character here. Okay? He is the only character that the narrator lets speak. He's a character that gets what he wants in a way that we don't know how it happened, but he did. God is somehow favoring and blessing and helping Daniel get what he needs. Daniel is being portrayed really as a wise statesman. He's being portrayed as an extraordinary sage, especially in comparison to the Babylonian experts who are just about to be torn limb from limb. In the next section, Daniel prays for God's wisdom. So this is verses 17 through 23. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the matter of the king." We don't get to hear Daniel pray. We didn't hear what he asked. We just hear his praise, his response to the answer. In this beautiful doxology, really, that Daniel praises God with, he affirms God's sovereignty, God's right to rule, his eternal kingdom. He talks about how God is the one who raises kings up and takes them down, gives knowledge, reveals deep and hidden things. A lot of the themes in this doxology are not only the themes of this chapter, but again of the book. So this is a God who raises kings up, takes them down. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he's going to see a statue that represents kings, kingdoms. God's going to take them down. As we go through the rest of the chapters, God raises up kings, he takes them down. This is the God with power. This is the God with wisdom. I'm going to skip past a few things here. Then we get to the longest section of the chapter. This is verses 24 through 45. This is where Daniel actually reveals the king's dream and the interpretation, and it showcases God's superior knowledge and the meaning of the dream. So I think I'm going to break this one up. I'm not going to read it all at once. This section is the climax of the chapter, so it resolves the conflicts. The conflict about Daniel and his friends being killed, it's taken care of because Daniel has the answer for the king. Death sentence is done. It also resolves the king's problem of not knowing what his dream meant. So it's the climax and the resolution. All right, so therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king's presence. I will declare the interpretation to the king." Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king." Well, now wait a minute. Did Arioch find him? Seems to me Daniel volunteered. I don't know. Maybe he's meaning to take credit. Maybe he's trying to look good, or maybe he's just really relieved that he can stop slaughtering wise men. I'm not sure. This sets up the contrast between Daniel and the other experts. So Daniel, according to Arioch, is among the exiles from Judah, which from chapter 1, we should be remembering, oh, those exiles from Judah, they're superior in all these ways, and they're the ones that God gave into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. This Daniel has a different God than all the Babylonian experts. Verse 26, the king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind on your bed. All right, so first of all, Daniel acknowledges those wise men were right. You asked something that was not possible. But lucky for you, king, there's a God in heaven who does reveal mysteries. This God has revealed a mystery to Nebuchadnezzar through this dream, and then he also reveals the mystery of the dream and the meaning to Daniel. This God is superior to all of the magicians and all the gods of Babylon. Daniel said that these events were going to take place in the latter days or the days to come. That's a vague reference in the Old Testament. It doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world, but rather something that's going to happen someday down the line at a future point. Verse 29, as for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. As for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. Daniel is in no hurry here. So remember, he's just stopped an execution. Arioch has hustled in before Nebuchadnezzar. What you might expect Daniel to say is, I've got the answer, let me tell you. Instead, we are several verses in, and he's still talking about the dreams that you had on your bed. You got it from God, and he's the one who reveals mysteries. Clearly, what's most important to Daniel here is not the actual dream, but the fact that God is the one who reveals mysteries. God is the one who has superior knowledge and wisdom to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel says he's not any smarter than anybody else. Only God knows, and he's chosen to reveal it. All right, finally we get to the dream. Verse 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So the king saw this huge statue that was magnificent because it was so brilliant and because it was so huge. It's made of 4 different metals. It's got a gold head, silver torso and arms, bronze belly and thighs, iron legs, and then iron clay feet. And then this rock comes and smashes the statue, smashes the feet, and the whole statue is pulverized with that. It falls to pieces as one. And then this extraordinary rock becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. So in ancient Near Eastern literature, this idea of gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, and even the statue and this vision that's going to turn out to mean kings and kingdoms, this is a familiar scheme. It's not just in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. What we don't know, we'll talk about that more in a minute. What we don't have anywhere else in ancient Near Eastern stories is this stone. There's nothing else like this supernatural stone that strikes the statue and fills the earth. We hear about it elsewhere in the Bible, though. Isaiah talks about the mountain of the house of the Lord, established as the highest of the mountains. He talks about filling the earth with the glory of the Lord, filling the earth with the knowledge of the Lord. And throughout Psalms, we have rocks representing God. So that might be part of why the stone is part of the imagery here. At the very least, we have this really ominous ending to the dream. This rock has smashed this magnificent statue to smithereens, and it fills the whole earth. Now we're in suspense. Then Daniel goes on, verse 36. That was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold. After you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron. Inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. In that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. That kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So that's the king's dream and the king's interpretation. We have this rise and fall of successive empires, successive kings. And there's a whole lot of attention that's been given to identifying these kingdoms. We got 4 kingdoms in the dream, but honestly, exactly identifying them isn't essential to understanding the dream, the message of the dream. The message is loud and clear. God is sovereign. His eternal kingdom supersedes, will destroy, will outlast all of these other kingdoms. And this dream is illustrating the themes that came out in Daniel's doxology. God raises kings up, he takes them down. He is the one who gives power and strength. What we are told is that Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. You, O king, are the head of gold. Then there's a second kingdom that's inferior. Then there's a third kingdom that's distinct because it's worldwide rule. And then we've got this fourth kingdom that is powerful and crushing, so it's ruthless and destructive. And yet it has this combination of strength and weakness. So who are these kingdoms? We'll come back to this a lot more when we get to chapter 7. But I do want to spend just a couple minutes talking you through some of sketching out how these views of the kingdoms go. So I'll just say that there's no consensus about the identity of the kingdoms after Babylon. So Daniel said the first one's Babylon. We're all good with that one. Then after that, let's get rid of this. There are 2 primary views, and they are based on who they identify as the fourth kingdom. So we've got Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In the dream, he sees a gold head. He sees silver torso. He sees bronze belly. He sees iron legs and clay iron feet. And he sees a rock. So those are the different components. What Daniel says about this dream, so Daniel's interpretation of it, is so simple. I love Daniel's interpretation because it's so simple. The interpretation. All right, the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, you are it. The silver chest is a second kingdom, an inferior kingdom that arises after Nebuchadnezzar. The third one is a third kingdom that rules the whole earth. The fourth one, this is a fourth kingdom. It crushes and breaks all the others. It's divided, the feet and the toes, partly strong, partly brittle, etc. And then the rock is God's kingdom that Daniel says endures forever and destroys all human kingdoms. So, that part you can believe fully. Then we have two main views and one smaller view that you will see in a few places. Okay, so the first view is the Roman view. And this is really the traditional view. And in fact, it's kind of enshrined in some versions of the Bible. If you have a Bible that gives you subheadings along the way, they may actually identify what the kingdoms are as Daniel interprets them. Give them names that Daniel doesn't give them. So for what that's worth, those are not inspired. All right, so in the Roman view, remember, these are named for their identification of the fourth kingdom. So we can fill that one in right away. Okay? They say the fourth kingdom is Rome. We'll come back to that. First kingdom is Babylon. Second kingdom is Medo-Persia. Third kingdom is Greece. And then Rome and the iron clay feet are usually explained as being some kind of revived Roman Empire or some extension of the old Roman Empire. And then the rock, of course, is God's kingdom, which is established both at the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. That's the traditional view. Then we have the Greek view. Oops, well, I'll put it up here. The Greek view, again, for its identification of the fourth kingdom, is Greece. The gold head is Nebuchadnezzar and or the whole kingdom of Babylon. There are a couple of variations on this view. So Daniel simply said that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. He didn't say all of Babylon. So you could tease that out a little bit. It could just be Nebuchadnezzar. It could be Babylon. The silver is Media. The bronze is Persia. And the fourth kingdom is Greece, which begins with Alexander the Great, and it ends in the sordid history of intermarriage between Alexander's successors. So the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, which we'll get to later. So that's the fourth kingdom. And, of course, this is God's kingdom. Okay. Then there's one other view that Goldingay holds, and a couple other commentators that I don't have with me have a four kings view. That's supposed to be Greece. Oh, it's a Greek view. Okay. Four kings. So this is kind of based on the fact that Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. So Nebuchadnezzar is obviously the first one. Well, then the rest of them, maybe they're also kings. And the suggestion is that they are the four kings named in the book of Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar would be the gold. Belshazzar would be the silver, and remember, he's definitely portrayed, well, you don't remember this, but in chapter 5, he's definitely portrayed as inferior to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. The third one would be Darius, but nobody really knows who he is exactly, so it's hard to say how he ruled the whole earth. And then Cyrus is the fourth named king. And this, of course, is God's kingdom. Now, these views, whatever view people have of the empires in chapter 2 is typically the view they will carry of the empires in chapter 7, with the exception of this one. This one only applies to chapter 2, specifically these 4 kings. When we get to 7, we can talk about that more. So, this is a very simple rendering of a very complex issue that we will spend a fair bit more time looking on later. I want to say that similar to some of the things we talked about with the late date and early date, where sometimes those views are considered litmus tests for orthodoxy, the same kind of applies here too. So traditionally speaking, this Greek view has been that of critical scholars, people who hold the late date for Daniel, while this has been, the view that most conservative scholars have held. And so there's a tendency to, if you hold this view, to say, oh, you can't hold this view. You must have a late date, a bad view of Daniel, you don't believe the Bible's true, whatever. That happens. I've read the literature, it's out there. But that's really not fair. When we come to this puzzle in chapter 2, we really have to look at chapter 7 and chapter 8, because those 3 chapters all use this imagery in different ways. And if you're going to look at Daniel as a piece of literature, I think you have to respect the fact that maybe there's something literary going on with these 3 different chapters. Again, that's more than I can give you in just chapter 2. You have to stick around for chapter 7 or chapter 8. My personal view, cards on the table, is this one, because I think it makes the best sense of the text. Historical issues aside, I think this one makes the best sense of the text when we keep going through the book of Daniel. Again, I will explain that more later, but that's probably quite enough for this right now. Let's finish up this chapter, verses 46 through 49. Then Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel, gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. So these last 3 verses, Nebuchadnezzar responds to the superior knowledge of Daniel's God, brings the chapter's events to a conclusion. The fact that Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face and did homage to Daniel, this is really actually an act of worship that he's doing. And what's probably happening is he recognizes Daniel as a representative of his God. So by falling down to Daniel, he's honoring Daniel's God. That's probably what's going on. Some people have said, well, why doesn't Daniel refuse that? He shouldn't let the king worship him. Well, for the author of Daniel, maybe what's more important is to show this powerful Gentile king bowing before the servant of a defeated God. That might be what the narrator is a little more interested in. Why does the king give no reaction to this interpretation? Why isn't he bothered by it? Well, I don't know, would you be bothered by it? You're the head of gold. By the time all this stuff happens, you're long gone from the scene. So there's really no reason that I can think of why Nebuchadnezzar would be bothered by this dream. He comes out looking pretty good. There's another character in the Old Testament who sort of has a similar reaction. In 2 Kings, Hezekiah, Isaiah prophesies to Hezekiah that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed at some point, but Hezekiah's not on my watch. I'm good. which maybe isn't quite the right reaction for God's chosen king. But nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar, he's got it made in this dream. Some people have wondered about Nebuchadnezzar's response to God. Is this some kind of conversion? He's acknowledging who God is. No, it's not, at least not at this point. Nebuchadnezzar is polytheistic. He's got all kinds of gods. And what he's doing here is acknowledging that Daniel's God is the God with the most wisdom and knowledge. Daniel's God is superior in those categories at least. So he's added another God to his pantheon, perhaps. He's acknowledging that he's the subject of a king who's greater than he is. Or at least he's acknowledging, at least at this point, that his kingship has been given to him by someone greater. So that brings us to the end of chapter 2, and we are headed into the fiery furnace in chapter 3.
This is Dr. Wendy Widder in her teaching on the book of Daniel. This is session number 5, Daniel chapter 2.